Imagine walking through the streets of Baghdad in the year 850. The air is thick with spice, dust, and the sound of traders shouting in dozens of languages. Camels kneel beneath sacks of silk. Merchants weigh gold on brass scales. And through this noise you hear another sound, softer but haunting. The shuffle of chained feet, the whisper of fear. You turn the corner and there it is, the slave market. A crowd gathers as a line of men, women, and children are led forward. Some are pale, taken from Byzantine villages. Others are dark-skinned, dragged from Africa. Some look like Persians, others like Turks. The auctioneer's voice is loud. A man's arm is grabbed, his muscles flexed for display. A girl's veil is lifted, her face studied by a buyer with cold eyes. Children cry out for their mothers, but the crowd doesn't flinch. This is not Rome. This is not Athens. This is the Abbasid Caliphate, one of the most celebrated empires of the Middle Ages. And yet, in the heart of its prosperity, human lives are bought and sold like livestock. This is their story, the story of the slaves of the Caliph. Long before the Caliphates, Arabia was a world of tribes, trade routes, and blood feuds. Slavery was already a fact of life. Captives from raids, orphans, debtors, they could all end up in chains. When Islam rose in the 7th century, it did not erase this system. Instead, it reshaped it. The Quran spoke of freeing slaves as charity. Some slaves were given rights unknown in Rome, but slavery itself remained. When Muslim armies surged outward, conquering Persia, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and beyond, the number of captives exploded. Every victory on the battlefield meant new prisoners. Every raid across the Mediterranean brought back women and children. Soon, an entire economy grew from their suffering. Caravans carried not only spices and silver, but lines of human beings. For the caliphs, slavery was not just tradition, it was power, wealth, and prestige. In Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and later Istanbul, slave markets became as common as bazaars. Travelers describe alleys packed with merchants and buyers. Picture a row of African boys, their heads shaved, bodies oiled to show their muscles. Beside them, pale-skinned women from the Caucasus, their hair brushed, their jewelry stolen. Nearby, children sit silently, holding one another's hands. Buyers walk among them with the confidence of men shopping for horses. They check teeth, squeeze arms, lift chins. A scribe records prices while guards keep watch. Some slaves are sold cheap, broken men, sickly children. Others are fortunes, a skilled artisan, a beautiful singer, a soldier with strength. For the wealthy, the purchase of a slave was not just about labor, it was status. Owning many slaves showed power. Owning the most beautiful concubines displayed wealth. And in the palaces of the caliphs, the fate of these captives would take a darker turn. The word harem stirs images of silk cushions, music, and luxury. But for most women who lived there, it was not paradise. It was a cage. Young girls from across the world were brought into harems as concubines. They had no choice in marriage, no voice in their future. Their bodies belonged to their masters. Some concubines bore children, and those children could rise to power. A concubine who gave birth to a caliph's son could suddenly wield enormous influence. History remembers women like Shajar al-Dur, a slave concubine who became the ruler of Egypt. But for every one woman who rose to prominence, thousands more lived in silence, beaten if they resisted, passed between masters if they displeased. Many spent their lives in windowless rooms, waiting to be called, never free, never safe. In the markets, they were examined openly, veils lifted, bodies touched, eyes judged. Some were taken for their beauty, others for music, others for nothing more than obedience. And though art and poetry would later romanticize the harem, the truth was far less enchanting. Behind the silks and perfumes was a world of fear, loneliness, and submission. Guarding these harems were the eunuchs, boys taken from distant lands, castrated, often with crude knives and little medicine. Most died from the operation. The few who survived became trusted servants of the caliphs. Their role was strange, powerless in one sense, yet powerful in another. Because they could not sire children, rulers trusted them to guard harems and deliver secrets. A eunuch could whisper into a caliph's ear, influencing decisions of state. In time, some became immensely wealthy and powerful. They owned property, commanded respect, and shaped politics. But beneath the robes and jewels, their lives were marked by pain. They had been mutilated, denied family, denied love. They became instruments of empire, loyal, silent, and broken. Not all slaves were destined for palaces. Some were destined for war. The Abbasids purchased young Turkic boys, raising them as soldiers, the Mamluks. Trained to ride, fight, and kill, they became one of the fiercest forces in the medieval world. Later, the Ottomans perfected this system with the Janissaries, Christian boys taken from the Balkans under the Devshirme system, seized from their families, converted, and turned into soldiers of the Sultan. These armies of slaves became the very backbone of empire. Ironically, they often rose to extraordinary power. The Mamluks not only served, They eventually overthrew their masters and ruled Egypt for centuries. But the price of that power was childhood stolen, families lost, and freedom denied. They became rulers, but they had begun as property. For most slaves, there was no harem, no palace, no armor. There was only work. In the salt marshes of southern Iraq, African slaves labored under burning sun. They stood waist-deep in brine, scraping salt until their skin cracked. Disease and death swept through the camps. On plantations, slaves bent over fields of sugar and cotton. In mines, they worked until their lungs filled with dust. In homes, they cleaned, cooked, and served. Disobedience was met with terror. Whipping, mutilation, branding, even crucifixion. Punishments designed not just to hurt one, but to warn all. Yet even under cruelty, some found small ways to resist, hiding food, telling forbidden stories, escaping into the night. In the 9th century, the slaves of southern Iraq rose up. Led by Ali ibn Muhammad, tens of thousands of African laborers launched the Zanj Rebellion. They seized cities, built fortresses, and for nearly 15 years, defied the Abbasid Caliphate. Their armies defeated Caliphate forces again and again, shaking the empire to its core. Though crushed in the end, the rebellion proved a truth rulers wished to hide. Slaves were not silent property. They were people who could dream, fight, and die for freedom. The Zanj Rebellion became one of the largest slave uprisings in world history, and though their names are mostly lost, their courage remains. The Islamic Caliphates are remembered in history books for their golden achievements. The dazzling mosques of Damascus and Cordoba, the scholars of Baghdad who preserved the wisdom of the ancient world, the poets and philosophers whose words still echo across centuries. To this day, we speak of the Islamic Golden Age as a time when knowledge, art, and culture flourished, while much of Europe lay in the shadows of the early Middle Ages. And all of this is true, but it is not the whole truth. For behind the gleaming domes and bustling libraries were millions of lives lived in silence. The farmers who bent beneath the sun in fields of sugarcane and cotton. The salt workers in Iraq who stood waist-deep in brine until their skin cracked and their bodies broke. The concubines locked within palace walls, their names erased, their children torn from them, their lives remembered only as whispers. The boys mutilated to become eunuchs, whose loyalty was forced not by devotion, but by suffering. The soldiers who became Mamluks and Janissaries, trained from childhood to serve rulers whose language and faith were not their own. These were the builders of empire, though their hands left no signatures on monuments and no verses in the pages of history. They labored, they served, they endured, and they died, often without a name, remembered only in numbers and records of sale. Their pain was the shadow that allowed the empire's brilliance to shine. To look back at the caliphates and see only their scholars and kings is to tell only half the story. To understand history fully, we must also give voice to those who were voiceless, to the millions who lived and died in chains, whose suffering made possible the splendor that others enjoyed. And so, as we close this chapter, let us remember them not as statistics or background figures, but as human beings, as men and women who felt joy and fear, who dreamed of freedom, who longed for family, who carried hope even when hope was nearly impossible. They are the shadows behind the light of history, and if we listen carefully, their silence still speaks.